Hi, how you doing? I've always been really very open about the fact that my background in martial arts, predominantly, with the exception of a few Japanese things when I was a teenager, is historical European martial arts, HEMA, and I'm pretty easy to find online. It's not a secret. Over the years, it's been really nice that more and more people have already kind of got an idea what HEMA is when I meet them and we talk. But there's a conversation that I've found myself having quite a few times within the world of combat sports. I'm going to talk about this quite a lot. So when I say combat sports, I'm talking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I'm talking about catch wrestling, I'm talking about MMA, I'm talking about submission grappling, that kind of thing. And the conversation that I have kind of starts with somebody saying to me, why is it that grappling and wrestling within HEMA is so crap? And I thought it might be interesting to explore that. One of the first things that we have to take into consideration when we try and answer that question is, what do they actually mean? And to understand that, you kind of have to understand the goal of what it is they're doing. And as soon as you do that, you realise that the goal of combat sports and the goal of HEMA are actually very different things. Within combat sports, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, catch wrestling, grappling in general, MMA, the goal of training is to get physically better at the task. It's quite competitive. The idea is to be better than the other person. Even an older grappler like myself, I'm not going out there with a view to competing. I'm not looking at getting into the ADCC or anything like that. That's not what I'm about. But when I step onto the mats and I'm looking to roll, I'm looking to get those techniques to work against an opponent who very much doesn't want me to get those techniques to work. I'm looking to get that cradle, or to perfect that takedown, to have to land in the right position, to get the submission, to get the tap, all of those things. And they're looking to do that to me. And there's this real, even in the short term, real competition. The idea is to get physically better at the skills you are practicing. But within HEMA, it's actually slightly different, because the art, in effect, died out. So what we're looking to do is recreate an art that has no background, no lineage. Now, there's an argument here that maybe some of those arts didn't die out, maybe they just evolved into different things, but the principle is exactly the same. Regency, bare knuckle boxing, or even possibly earlier, is not the same as modern boxing. Lichtenauer school longsword is not the same as modern fencing, despite the fact that you can dubiously claim a lineage from one to the other. So what we're actually looking at doing is trying to understand what this system is teaching and recreate it in a historical form. And that's the goal of HEMA, is to recreate a historical European martial art, not just to be better at fighting than the person you're facing. So it may well be that while you're training, you're running a technique. You're not just trying to be better at it than the other person. You're trying to be more authentic, more historically accurate. But there's more to it than that, because within HEMA, there's a real academic side to what we do. And HEMA as a physical art can't exist without the academic art. Those people who have gone out and have searched through libraries, through private collections, through museums, to find these original source material, books or manuscripts, treatises, whatever you want to call them, from a historical period that no longer exists. These things aren't done, but they exist in this kind of snapshot form. People have spent years and years of their lives tracking these down so that we've got access to them. And often they're written in a different language, so that needs translating. And that in itself raises some very interesting points, because it's not just that it may be a different language, it may be a language that doesn't exist anymore, but also it's going to be a historical form of language. If you're reading something that's written in English but was written in the 15th century, it's going to be really difficult to read unless you're used to that, unless you've spent a lot of time studying that. And there are a lot of nuances, there's a lot of kind of linguistic usages that were very common and standard then that aren't the same as they are now. And that's quite a difficult academic subject to get into. But the problem is that a lot of the language that's used in historical combat manuscripts is very combat specific. It's almost jargon, if you like. So you have to understand what's going on with the physical art that they're talking about to kind of understand the language. And it may well be that when you translate this and you put it into modern language, there are 3 or 4 different ways of interpreting that set phrase, which then gives you 3 or 4 different techniques. So the partnership between this dry academic translation, historical interpretation, and the physical art of actually swinging a sword or a fist or trying to effect a throw have to work in partnership. And that doesn't happen in modern combat sports. Another thing that's worth talking about is the fact that within HEMA we don't have a kind of a set hierarchy or a lineage. So when a group forms, it forms around a person as a general rule of thumb. Originally, some groups have got quite big and have split off and have got multiple instructors all all training under the same group name. But the fact is that the people that started these groups were all people that went out and they did this historical research and they did this physical training and they tried to put these things together and they came up with their own interpretation. And that's how a group starts. But they didn't have an instructor. So there's nobody to say, yes, you are getting this technique right, or to say, oh, when you tried this technique, it didn't work. This is why. So it's always a really kind of slow and incremental learning process. And there's a trap that a lot of us fall into from time to time of thinking, yeah, I've got this, and then kind of stopping thinking about it. And what that leads to is kind of differences of interpretation. And this is something that causes quite a problem within the HEMA community. Is because we've got this kind of flat hierarchy, we've got an almost tribalistic nature. So you'll get a person in a place studying a manuscript coming up with an interpretation that they feel works and fits the text. And you'll get somebody somewhere else in a different place that studies the same manuscript and may come up with something slightly different. And what we tend to do within HEMA is we set our stall up against these people, and there have been, over the last few decades in HEMA, some huge fallings out over quite small matters of interpretation, because people kind of pin their reputation to what they're doing and their interpretation and how they practice and teach it. And when somebody questions that, they're questioning their whole reputation, but we've got no proof. So it becomes quite personal, and you get this kind of inward-focused, backbiting, kind of argumentative community that's preventing itself from growing. And that, again, stops growth, because we grow in combat sports by cross-training, by getting out there, by rolling with more people, by sparring with people, by putting ourselves out there, and that doesn't happen to anywhere near the same degree within the HEMA community. It's starting to, more and more, but we're starting to see a separation between those physical competitive types and those academic historical types. And I wonder if that's maybe damaging HEMA, but that could just be me because I've been in it for a long time and I'm a bit of an old man when it comes to this. But there's more, even more, because HEMA's got a really kind of open community, and this is both a strength and a weakness. It's a strength because it allows us to bring in kind of lots of different people and different perspectives and mindsets. And that allows us to see things slightly differently and maybe pick up on things that we weren't doing quite as well, or things we might have otherwise missed. And when I say this, I'm not talking about, people who are old and people who are young, though that's part of it. I'm talking about the fact that there's quite a lot of women involved in HEMA. Not as many as there should be, I'd like to say, but there are some very skilled HEMA practitioners and researchers. There are women. There are gay, there are straight, there are people in between, there are trans people, there are cisgender people, there are black people, there are brown people, there are white people. It just doesn't matter. In general, and there are a few exceptions to this, but we're not going to talk about those people, the HEMA community is incredibly welcoming of people, whoever they are, whatever their background is. And that's a huge strength for us. That's one of the things that has allowed us to grow. It's become a safe place for people to be who they are and just enjoy this art of combat that isn't quite as testosterone fueled, as competitive, as physically taxing and demanding as some of the other combat sports are. But that in itself is also a bit of a weakness, because the people that are in that combat sport see this group of mixed gender, mixed age, mixed ability, people who are disabled, people who are struggling, people who are fat, people who are thin, and we're all part of this fantastic HEMA community. But it doesn't look like the community that you get in combat sports. So they can look at that and say, well, these people clearly wouldn't last a minute doing what I do. But that's not the point. They're not supposed to, because what HEMA isn't the same as combat sports. And I guess that from my perspective, it's quite interesting, because I play very happily on both sides of the fence. My goal within HEMA, and I've been doing HEMA for 25 or more years, has always been to try and make it a little bit more acceptable in the mainstream martial arts community. And that's one of the reasons that I found myself within this combat sports area and having a lot of fun. But I'm still a HEMA guy at heart. And I still love the old books, the manuscripts, the old language. I love, the kind of the academic challenge, the discussions, that kind of theoretical side that you get within HEMA that you don't necessarily get in combat sports. So I think that when we say why is the skill level in HEMA wrestling and grappling so low, it's like, well, it isn't. It's just different. Now, all that being said, I do have to say that I've noticed in some groups, some practitioners are practicing moves and they're doing it without any real resistance at all. And there are some Oriental martial arts out there that are kind of teaching whole systems that simply do not work when resistance is applied to those techniques. I'm not going to go into any detail. We might do in a future video, but for now we're not. And I think that there is a little bit of that creeping into HEMA, in that it's fun to do these, and these techniques are great, and if I do this and I step here and this, you'll fall over, and that's great. But, in reality, that person wouldn't fall over. So I guess maybe they have a slight point, but maybe not. Maybe they've actually missed the point. What do you think? I'd be really interested to hear what you think. Do you play on both sides of the fence? Are you involved in HEMA and in combat sports? I know quite a lot of my subscribers here are. And I'd be really interested to hear if you've had this conversation too. And if you have, what's your take on it? Have I missed the point myself, or am I being fair? Really, really interested to hear what you have to say. So stick something in the comments. And I just want to end by saying, fight team.